The desert was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel sharp and dangerous. Heat shimmered above the rocks as Naya moved carefully along the dry wash, her fingers brushing aside thorny brush as she searched for medicinal roots her people had used for generations. She knew this land well, yet she also knew it could turn deadly without warning. The warning came too late. A sudden vibration buzzed through the air, followed by a flash of movement at her feet. Pain exploded in her leg as sharp fangs pierced her skin. She cried out and stumbled back, falling hard into the sand. The rattlesnake recoiled and vanished between the stones, leaving behind only its echo and the burning agony spreading through her calf. Naya's breath came fast as she pressed her hand over the wound. Two dark punctures stared back at her, already swelling, the skin tightening as venom worked its way through her blood. She had seen this before. She knew what it could mean. Alone and far from her people, the desert suddenly felt endless. She forced herself to stay calm, ripping a strip from her clothing to bind her leg. But dizziness crept in, and the edges of the world began to blur. Then through the ringing in her ears, she heard hoofbeats. A lone rider appeared over the rise, his horse moving at an easy pace, dust clinging to its legs. The man wore a weathered hat pulled low and carried himself like someone who had survived more than his share of hard days. Eli Carter reined in sharply when he saw her collapsed on the ground. One look at her pale face and swollen leg told him everything. He dismounted quickly, scanning the ground before kneeling beside her. "Snake?" he asked. She nodded, her jaw tight with pain. Eli had seen rattler bites before, had buried men who didn't make it through the night. He didn't hesitate. He tied off her leg above the wound with practiced speed, his hands steady despite the danger. The desert wind stirred around them as he leaned closer, examining the bite. "There ain't much time," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. There was no fear in his gaze, only resolve. Naya studied him for a brief second, then gave a small nod. Trust was a risk, but death was closer. Eli bent down, placed his mouth to the wound, and drew out the poison, spitting blood and venom into the sand again and again. The taste was foul, his head swimming, but he continued until his vision dimmed and his lungs burned. When he finally pulled back, both of them knew the fight for her life had only just begun. Eli leaned back on his heels, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as his head swam from the effort. The bitterness of venom lingered on his tongue, and for a brief moment he wondered if he had just sealed his own fate. He pushed the thought away and focused on the woman in front of him. Naya's breathing was shallow, her skin damp with sweat despite the cooling air of the approaching evening. He tightened the binding above her leg, careful not to cut off the blood completely, then glanced around the open desert. There was no cabin, no town, no doctor within a day's ride. "We can't move you far," he said, his voice low but steady. "You need to stay awake." Naya nodded faintly. She reached for the bundle of roots she had dropped when she fell, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a thick, knotted plant. With slow determination, she crushed it between two stones. Releasing a sharp, earthy smell, Eli watched closely as she pressed the dark paste onto the wound, layering it beneath the cloth he had tied. "This will help draw the poison," she said, her voice strained but sure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert cooled quickly. Eli gathered dry brush and struck a small fire, its flames flickering against the vast darkness creeping in from all sides. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing through the empty land. Naya shivered, whether from the cold or the venom he could not tell. He removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders without a word. The hours stretched painfully long. Fever came in waves, stealing color from her face and leaving her eyes glassy. Each time her head drooped, Eli spoke to her, asking simple questions, telling her stories about cattle drives and dust, storms and nights spent under stars just like these. His voice became an anchor, something to hold her to the present. At one point she studied him through half-lidded eyes. "You risked your life," she murmured. Eli shrugged slightly, though his jaw tightened. Didn't seem like much of a choice. The fire crackled softly as the night deepened. Eli checked her leg often, relieved to see the swelling slow, the skin no longer stretching tighter by the minute. He spat into the sand once more, tasting blood but feeling no sickness of his own. Still, he stayed alert, knowing the danger wasn't past. When dawn finally began to stain the sky with pale light, Naya's breathing evened out. Her fever eased, and for the first time since the snake struck, hope crept quietly into the desert with the rising sun. Morning light spread slowly across the desert, washing the rocks and sand in pale gold. Eli stirred the fire back to life as Naya slept, her face calmer now, the hard lines of pain softened by rest. He watched her chest rise and fall, steady and sure, and allowed himself a breath of relief. The worst of the night had passed, but he knew better than to believe danger was gone. Snake venom could turn cruel without warning. When Naya woke, she tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her leg. Eli was at her side immediately, guiding her back down. He loosened the binding slightly and checked the wound. The swelling had stopped spreading, and the dark discoloration had faded to a dull red. It was a good sign. She exhaled slowly, strength returning with each breath. "You stayed," she said quietly, her voice clearer than it had been hours before. "Seemed like the right thing," he replied, handing her a canteen. She drank carefully, the water trembling at her lips. As the sun climbed higher, they talked to keep her alert. Naya spoke of her people, of moving with the seasons and listening to the land as if it were alive, because to her it was. She told him how every plant had a purpose, every creature a lesson. Eli listened in a way few ever had, realizing how little he truly knew about the land he crossed so often. In return, he told her of endless cattle trails, of towns that rose and fell overnight, of a life spent always riding toward the next horizon. Though their worlds were far apart, something familiar passed between them: loss, endurance, and the quiet understanding of survival. By midday, a distant movement caught Eli's eye. Shapes appeared on the horizon, riders moving with purpose. His muscles tensed out of instinct, his hand drifting near his rifle. Naya followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "My people," she said. Eli stepped back and lifted his hands away from his weapon, choosing stillness over fear. The riders approached swiftly, eyes sharp, bows and rifles ready. Naya called out in her language, her voice strong despite her injury. She spoke quickly, gesturing toward Eli and then to her leg. The tension eased as understanding spread among them. Weapons were lowered. One of the riders dismounted and knelt beside Naya, inspecting the wound with practiced care. He nodded in approval. They helped her onto a horse, securing her gently. Before mounting, Naya looked back at Eli. Gratitude filled her eyes, deep and unspoken. In that moment, both knew the desert had bound their stories together in a way neither would ever forget. The ride back to the Apache camp was slow and careful, the horses moving in steady rhythm as the desert unfolded around them. Naya stayed upright in the saddle, supported on either side, her leg throbbing but no longer aflame with poison. Eli walked beside them at first, then mounted when one of the riders gestured for him to join. The wary eyes followed his movements. There was no hostility now, only watchful silence. The land seemed to breathe differently as they crossed into territory shaped by memory and tradition, rather than fences and trails. The camp came into view near a cluster of cottonwood trees, their leaves whispering in the morning breeze. Women and children emerged from the lodges as the riders returned, concern turning quickly to relief when they saw Naya alive. She was helped down and guided to a shaded place where elders waited. They examined her leg, nodding as they applied fresh poultices and bound it with clean cloth. Quiet words were spoken, prayers carried on smoke and wind. Eli stood back, unsure of his place, dust-stained and suddenly aware of how far from his own world he was. Food and water were offered to him, simple gestures that carried weight in a harsh land. He accepted with a respectful nod, sitting near the fire as the camp resumed its gentle rhythm. Children watched him with open curiosity, while the elders studied him with calm, measured eyes. No accusations were made, no questions demanded. Naya spoke for him when she was able, telling them what he had done, how he had placed his own life at risk without hesitation. As the sun began its slow descent, Naya approached Eli, leaning on a carved walking stick, Her strength was returning, though the wound would take time to fully heal. "You turned death away from me," she said, her voice steady. "That creates a bond." Eli shifted uncomfortably. "I just helped," he replied. "Anyone should have." She shook her head gently. "Not everyone would." At dawn the next morning, Eli prepared to leave. He packed his saddle in silence, the sounds of the camp waking around him. Naya stood nearby, watching. When he mounted, she placed her hand briefly over her heart, then extended it toward him. He mirrored the gesture, a simple exchange filled with meaning. He rode out as the sun lifted over the horizon, the desert stretching wide and familiar once more. Behind him, Naya returned to her people, carrying a scar that marked survival. Ahead of him lay endless miles, but something had changed. In a land ruled by danger and distance, a single act of courage had bridged two worlds, leaving a mark deeper than any trail in the sand.